I have been facilitating computer training for a long time, but to this day, I still am impressed by the amount of technology behind the things we now take for granted. We've become so accustomed to just clicking a button or tapping an option that we've lost our childlike fascination awe of all of it. When is the last time that you actually thought about what happens when you send an email or a text message? Yeah, that's what I thought. It doesn't happen very often anymore, does it? It's just something we do. I want to take a few minutes to reintroduce you to the awe-inspiring process by which email is sent and received. Now, it's not just to get you oohing and awing, it's so we can better understand why and how things happen when we use Outlook. But still, if you get a little technology buzz from it, I won't be too disappointed. To get us started, whether you consider yourself a Trekkie or not, that's as in Star Trek, we can use an analogy from there that most of us will understand. In Star Trek, they used a transporter to beam people from one place to another. People just kind of dissolve into a glittery little cloud, then they reappear in the same way at their destination. It's not exactly the same thing, but I want you to remember that analogy of how things work at Star Trek when we talk about how email kind of dissolves from our own desktop and appears somewhere else. As we said, most of us don't think twice about what actually occurs when we send email. We click or tap something, type in some words, and hit send, and email just disappears from our screen and appears next door or around the globe in less than a few seconds, without a second thought by us. It is amazing, but certain things do occur that we need to be aware of. First of all, we launch some type of application. In our case, it's going to be Outlook. This is known as an email client because it's how we work with email. Using that software, we launch some type of form. Usually, people just think of this as creating an email. It has all of that information we need to include, like addressing it to someone, putting in a subject, and then, of course, adding the body of the message. For some of us, the hardest part is knowing how to fill out the email address. This is what a typical email address looks like. After we finish composing our message, we click or tap that wonderful little send option that's somewhere on our screen. It magically zips from our computer, and here's where we need to get into the intricacies of what happens from there, because this is the point most of us stop thinking about it. Once it leaves our computer, it actually goes to a mail server. If this is in an office, then it's probably an internal mail server. That mail server then takes a look at the email address. This is where the part at the top of our screen becomes important, because it doesn't start with the recipient username. It actually goes to the other end. The mail server takes a look at the domain name and the top-level domain name. Something like gmail.com or yahoo.com or yourcompany.net or whatever it may be. Because the domain name is what actually identifies the mail server to which this message needs to be delivered. If you're sending a message to your colleague that's within the same company, the mail server doesn't have to go that far. It's kind of like if you want to get a message to your roommate or your spouse. You don't need to go all the way out of the house. All you need to do is walk across the house and find them in the living room or the family room. For internal messages, it never leaves the internal mail server. It simply goes from your computer to the person's computer who needs it. But it gets more complicated if it does need to leave the company. The mail server is going to look at the last part of that email address, and if it's not in our company or business, our server is going to start asking around. It's kind of like a junior high school rumor where people kind of whisper each other, "Do you know Cheryl? Do you know Mike?" If a person says yes, great. If not, then you keep asking, "Have you ever heard of Mike or have you ever heard of Cheryl?" The server's going to do the same thing. It starts asking. And if it's not inside the company, it needs to ask outside the company, which is usually the internet. The internet is simply a collection of many, many, many different servers, and they're all kind of hanging around, and they know people. So our server asks around, "Do you know this person or this domain?" If a computer says no, it just kind of stops there. But they might say, "Well, I don't know them directly, but I know somebody who does." So they pass it along. This chain continues until eventually we find the person or the domain that we're looking for. This is going to be the recipient's server. This might be, again, something like Gmail or Yahoo, or it might be their company server or their internet service provider. So far, we've taken care of the last part of the email address. We've gotten it to the right destination, the right domain, but now we have to get it into the right mailbox. So the recipient's mail server takes a look at the first part, the recipient username, and says, "Do I know that person? Do they have an account on my system?" If they do not, then that server will kick it back with an error message saying, "Yes, you found the right domain, but we don't know who that person is." It's kind of like when you get mail delivered to your house and it's to the wrong person. Yeah, they got the address right, but that person doesn't live here, or they don't have this post office box anymore. We hope that doesn't happen too often. What we do hope happens is that the recipient's mail server knows who that person is. They deliver the message directly to that person's mailbox. The next time the recipient opens their mailbox by using Outlook or webmail or whatever their particular email client is, they can see your message. That is what actually occurs every time we click or tap that little send button. All of that happens in the blink of an eye. Not only does the text get delivered, but it also might include things like files, pictures, or even video, those attachments. And that, my friends, is amazing and deserves a little bit of respect every time we click on that send button. Getting back to our Star Trek analogy. Like Star Trek, in order to be moved, our messages do get broken down into much smaller pieces. They get sent to the desired destination and then put back together again, just like in Star Trek when people dissolve and then kind of dissolve back again wherever their destination is. Like the transporter, we don't really get to see how this happens, but it does, and we certainly know when it doesn't happen correctly. Unlike Star Trek, though, where things just get beamed and reconstructed, our email does go through specific pathways or channels via networks and often the internet as well. Yes, today those can be wireless pathways, unlike 20 years ago when they all required wires. But still, it's a definite path by which messages are sent, and they conform to standards too. It's those standards that make sure that we can send email not only to our colleagues, but our friends, our family, whether they're in our country or located anywhere around the world. I actually get very excited about this whole process because to me it is still so amazing, and there is a whole lot more that we could know about it. But for our purposes, that is probably enough for now. Hopefully the Star Trek analogy creates a visual that you can imagine as you work. If it doesn't, though, just think about regular snail mail. It too must be put into an envelope. It too must have an address, and the address has to be formatted correctly for the post office to be able to know where to send it. Usually the important parts are things like the city-state zip code and the physical street address. That then gets sorted through different post offices. It could be one, or it could have to go through many post offices before it finally gets to the destination. A carrier then puts it into a specific mailbox. Maybe this is at the house. Once that happens, somebody has to then take the whole stack of mail, figure out what goes to mom, what goes to dad, what goes to grandma, or whatever the roommates may be, and finally, those people are able to read their mail, just like we can eventually read our email messages that are specifically addressed to us as well. You see, even though these processes in some ways are vastly different, and some requires a lot of technology and others does not necessarily require so much, they really are more similar than they are different. Unfortunately, one of the similarities is we can also get junk mail and bulk mail sent via email too. But that's a topic for a different discussion. All we need to remember is that the process is basically the same, even though it's done in different ways. And of course, email can be delivered in seconds instead of days or weeks. The most important part of this whole discussion, though, is understanding email, how it works, and appreciating the process behind clicking that send button.